Good morning.
Good morning. Now you know what it's like to be a teacher.
I feel like I'm in church or something. Everybody's sitting in the back. Good morning. How's everybody feeling? Thank you. Everybody have their coffee? Because I know how y'all are when you don't have your coffee. Especially Thomas Nelson people. Like that mouthwash commercial. You know, no, don't kiss me, don't kiss me. Don't say anything to Thomas Nelson people until they have their coffee. So everybody has their coffee, they're smiling. Oh, I'm a little nervous about this, but I should do okay. I have a few announcements before I start. The VCCA has a table, and everybody needs to sign up. Renee Peterson, Tom Kellen, and Adrian East will be manning that table. So please sign up. Okay, I know everybody's waiting for me to make a comment about last night, but I'm not. I just get the feeling there's somebody sitting down in the Bahamas, smiling and laughing, saying, I got him. Being that Mr. Wilder made his speech last evening, the administrative people here have decided to do some fundraising of their own to help the college out, and I'd like to announce those projects that they're attempting to do. Dean Carver, who is renowned for his fashion etiquette, has decided to put out a line of sport coats. I hear the used car salesman look is going to be hot for the 90s. Dr. Wolf and Dr. Dolgen have decided to get together and form a rep group. The name of the group is kind of long. It's called Two Live Women from a College with Two Small Parking Lots. They have a couple of singles that'll be coming out in a few weeks. I'd like for y'all to look for it in the record store. One of them is called Wetlands, You Can't Touch This. And the second is called Money, We Want Some. And not to be last, Dr. Templin has really gone out to try to raise some money for the college. We're presently in negotiations with Don King. We're waiting to see who's going to win the fight between Buster Douglas and Tyrone Big Fight. Dr. Templin will fight the winner. If there's anybody here from the PE department, we would like y'all to help us, get him in shape. But he says he's ready. We should get about 10 or 15 million out of the deal. Keep that right up, champ. During the last week, people have asked me, what are you going to speak on? I said, well, I'm not making a speech. I'm just welcoming, telling everybody, welcome and have a good time kind of thing. So this is what I'm going to do. Roy Budd told me yesterday, well, you just do the welcome and introduce Dr. Temple. So make it short. So I'm going to make it short. So I'd like for all of you to have a nice time today. We're in a nice facility here, even though you want to sit in the back. I don't understand that. Hope you enjoy yourself. We're having free food. So I know that's why some of you are here. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you probably the next heavyweight champion of the world. They call him the Grand Pooper of Thomas Nelson, the Honorable Dr. Temple.
Now, he's not telling you the truth. He told me it was a tag team wrestling match and I could use my whole family. Well, good morning. Our leader of the Commonwealth of Virginia had a message last night. I'm not sure yet how it affects us, but I got a feeling I lost my state car. Now, Governor Beliles, when he was with us last, promised me a helicopter. I think I'm going to tell Governor Wilder, I'll give in my state car when you give in your helicopter. Well, as you know, the governor had some somber words. I know that much of that, because we have been talking about it and preparing for it, did not hit you as a surprise. I think some of his announcements were unexpected. I hope that his plan is, as he said it was, tough but fair. I think all of us at Thomas Nelson Community College are willing to do our fair share. I don't think there's any single group of employees that wants to be singled out, or do we want any group of employees to be singled out to make sacrifices greater than any other group. I think that we stand as a unit, as a family, prepared to do what we must. The details of the plan are being unveiled this morning before the Senate Finance and House Appropriation Committees. That will have to be filtered down through the Secretary of Education to the State Board for Community Colleges, which will in turn issue our direction. So it's going to be a while before we know exactly what the implications of the cuts will be for Thomas Nelson Community College. We have a school year to get on with, so we won't tarry thinking about what might be, but knowing that we're fully prepared to deal with what might come, knowing that we're strong in our resolve to serve our students. In that theme, we have a program today, which is a very exciting one of the best, if not the best, since I've been here. Special tribute to the committee that planned today's events. As we look over the agenda, we will be taking on a particular international focus today. International not only with regard to global perspectives, but with regard to celebrating diversity. Diversity amongst ourselves, amongst our students and our community. We'll look at one of the college's initiatives with regard to internationalizing the curriculum and why that's important to all of us, not just those in the classroom, but all of us that are part of the Thomas Nelson Community College family. There'll be breakout sessions after our opening session after the keynote presentation by Dr. Gary Weaver, who's with us. We will look at internationalizing the business curriculum, developing a theme that we started last year of becoming more aware and sensitive to the differences among us and among our students, taking a look at a very special set of initiatives that the college has taken leadership on in working with public schools starting in the middle school, and the importance of our all understanding and supporting the goal of critical thinking of our students and integrating that within the curriculum. This afternoon, after lunch and then into the afternoon session, we are very fortunate to have with us an educational leader from Miami-Dade Community College who will relate to us the importance of technological developments for the way that we do our work, not only in the classroom, but the capabilities that it has for our institution as a learning community. We have every reason to celebrate today and to celebrate in the program that's been structured. As I think about today and I think about the tasks that we have before us, I'm reminded of the words of a friend of our great patriot Thomas Nelson. 200 years ago, Benjamin Franklin wrote in his autobiography words that I think guide us today. Resolve to do what you must and fail not to do what you resolve. We have the resolve to make this our best year. It must be our best year. We can do no less. Welcome to today. We'll get on with the activities. Dr. Ann Goldman.
I have some good news. One of the pieces of good news that I'll share with you a little bit later on is Project International Emphasis. We managed to get that grant in before the whole budget crisis erupted, so we were very, very fortunate. But let me start the theme because I'm very excited about Pam and Ann being here as part of this team on international education. But my introduction really deals with the term global illiteracy. When we think about illiteracy, usually we think about reading, writing, and math calculations. But there's a larger illiteracy out there, not just in the field of geography or science or sociology. And it hits home when you look at some of the statistics. As an example, you're aware that 25% of Dallas seniors can't identify that their southern neighbor is Mexico. Or in a recent study, which is even more frightening and has implications for all of us, 50% of students in our schools believe that foreign governments have dangerous ideas and can hurt the United States of America. In addition to that, we have 3 out of every 5 jobs really dependent on foreign trade. I came across an interesting marketing concept. Chris, how would you grade somebody in business doing this? There was an advertising campaign in Taiwan, "Come alive with Pepsi." It was translated as, "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave." Another beaut, the Parker Pen Company. Parker Pen Company meant to advertise abroad that unwanted leaks could be avoided. What its copywriters said was that its products could help prevent unwanted pregnancies. I think that Gloria Smith would agree that one of the most devastating things that has happened in American education in 1980 was that only 15% of our high school graduates took a foreign language. So that's why international education and how it affects us has always been important to me personally. So when a group of us met together at a dean's meeting, we decided to write a grant and in the area of international education, with the emphasis being on teaching modules which would hit every student and every faculty member throughout the entire community college system, but add an additional component to it. And that was in the area of educating students what wonderful career opportunities there were, not only working for companies abroad, but even our companies at home that deal with exports abroad. So we were awarded $329,000 plus another $20,000 from the VCCS to integrate or infuse international education components within our curriculum. The beginning of August, 2 representatives from our college were there with me to hear some fantastic speakers and to learn how to share with you when we got home how to accomplish this particular task. Pam Turner and Ann Dowd were with me, and I think they're going to infuse among you the excitement and the possibilities of this excellent grant. We were told by all of our guest speakers that we are the only state in the entire country that is systematically working to infuse international education in our curriculum and add an additional component, career education. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Pam Turner.
Ann and I spent a lovely week together. We got to room in the dorms at George Mason and share the wonderful communal bathrooms and the bunks made by the Department of Prisons. But that was a good thing because we had absolutely no distractions in terms of studying international education. Our goal was to become sensitized, I believe, to international education and the needs for it, and to develop some ideas as to how we might assist our campuses as we move toward global education. Of course, my area was global guidance and vocational education, and we had the opportunity to talk with a private consultant, Fran Jeffries, who is a specialist in international employment. And he and others, such as Sonia Peterson from West Virginia University, and Caroline Willard, who is with the International Student Center at Bakersfield Community College in California, gave us a lot of ideas. Our goal is to have 3 hours in the vocational education area of curriculum, and that curriculum will be designed to set the stage in our new students through the orientation modules so that they are more receptive in the classroom to the idea of global education, that they are more receptive to the idea of the international aspects of employment that they will face later on when they're ready to graduate. Ann and I got an unexpected extra multicultural experience in addition to trips to the Egyptian Embassy and the World Bank and that sort of thing. Our bus left us in the Adams Morgan section of Washington, D.C. at 9 o'clock at night. And we got to work with an Ethiopian restaurant owner to help us find a cab driver and convince him to help us have a very reasonable cab fare back to George Mason University. I look forward to working with all of you this year in terms of getting your ideas as to things that the Counseling Center might do to assist you in any way possible as you work with students toward global education. And very much look forward working with Ann because we'll be doing additional things other than curriculum development in our own areas. Thank you.
We did have an exciting week. It was a good week at George Mason, part of which was devoted to really getting to know people from other schools and what they were doing in international education. And one of the great surprises and pleasures, I think, for me was to see that Thomas Nelson was, again, and we've heard this before, but it was really true, that Thomas Nelson is, in fact, again, a little bit ahead of the game in terms of internationalizing curriculum and being aware. Many of the participants at the seminar came there with the idea that this was a conference that they had been chosen to go to, and really very little preparation and little preparation back home for internationalizing and incorporating international education into the curriculum. So, as Dr. Templin said, with last year being a build-up and an introduction to international education, I felt that we were really well prepared to take the next step rather than to be going through the initial stages as some of these participants felt they were doing with their colleges. As we have indicated, the grant includes every community college and all 34 campuses. Everyone sent a team. There were 34 teams composed of a faculty member and a career counselor being sent to this conference. Pam and I, of course, are the first part of this campus team, but we hope to expand this to a larger core. In awarding this grant, the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia is indicating, I believe, its conviction that there is tremendous importance in expanding the perspective of our students, that it is not just a recognition that trade and world trade and global education is important to the economic lives of our students, but that it is important to their lives generally as citizens and members of the 21st century. As our speaker last year, Van Wishard, indicated, this world has not become a global living room. It is more, global village. It is more like a global living room. It has shrunk even more. And with that, I think it is important to realize that we are going to have a direct bearing on our students who are going to be citizens living the majority of their lives in the 21st century. The grant itself envisions several things. The teleconferences come first, and the first teleconference to which all of you are invited is in October. The second one will be in February, and they will be beamed to our campus and picked up via satellite and so on. They will go on this year, and then there will be some next year as well. There is also an institute next summer, probably going to be in the Tidewater area. Having made our bow to Northern Virginia, now we're going to make them come our direction. And then thirdly, there are the modules that Dr. Dolgen referred to, which are going to be amassed and used as a resource bank for all of us in the community college system. Many of us feel the constraints a lot of times about the system requiring us to do different things, and because it's a system, we can't go off independently and do our own thing. But in fact, this is a time that I think the system works to our advantage, where we can share, in fact, and not reduplicate, not cross over other boundaries, but in fact see what other people around the state are doing. So we are going to have, at the end of the 2 years, 400 courses are targeted for internationalizing. And that includes career development courses as well. And included in that will be the resources of all of these courses and the modules, how different people have developed different courses. And they can be the same course. It doesn't have to be, oh, somebody from Northern Virginia did English 111, therefore I can't do it. There are going to be many, many ways that people are seeing for internationalizing courses. But there will be, at the end of the 2 years, 400 courses that have been internationalized, and the resource bank of both these modules, an abstract to describe them, and materials, audiovisual materials as well. Many of you probably see this as I do, which is it is a chance for professional development. Having taught the same course for many years, you seek to find some new angle, some new perspective for your own self. It is, of course, a selfish motive. It is good for students, but it is good for us as well, as faculty members really looking for a chance to learn on our own and incorporate a larger perspective. Through the year, Pam and I will be looking for you, and like the Marines, we'll be looking for a few good men and women who want to join us in this exciting road ahead. We are really looking forward to this and working with you, and I hope to talk to you more later about the possibilities and the range of things that we can do. Without further ado, let me then introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Gary Weaver. Dr. Weaver was one of the highlights of our conference last week, and we feel very privileged to have him here this morning. He, as you can see from the description in the program, has tremendous versatility as a lecturer, as an educator, as a writer. He has been a resource to businesses. One of the ones that we share in common was the National Training Labs, which was the first job I worked at after college. He has been a consultant and a lecturer to government agencies. He is a lecturer on a wide range of topics, as you can see, from the Black identity movement to hostage taking and negotiations. His experience includes living abroad in Tehran and Sri Lanka, so he has had a tremendous amount of experience and international life of his own, and I think we are really privileged to hear him this morning. Dr. Gary Weaver.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. In the half hour or so that I have to talk, in all likelihood, I will not say anything new or revolutionary. That is, I think you people are well ahead of the curve from what I've heard. But as a faculty member, this doesn't apply to you staff people here, but for the faculty, we all know that if you come up with something new and revolutionary, in many cases you just get in trouble. The way to get tenure and to become a full professor is to simply state the obvious arrogantly. And that's probably what I'll be doing today for you. So bear that in mind. As was mentioned in the introductory comments, the whole area of cross-cultural diversity, multicultural education, global education is the in thing right now. And it's not just in academia, it's throughout the country. We at our university have gone through the same questioning that you've gone through. And in fact, we spent 2 or 3 years trying to internationalize our curriculum. There were 2 national task forces that recommended that all universities somehow require their students to know something about global affairs. And we on our campus decided last year that every single student will take a gen ed course in intercultural communications and international relations. So it's now required of every student, even if you're an art major. And this is happening throughout the country. I do agree that I think Virginia is way ahead of most of the country, even our own university. More has been published in this field, this broad area, in the last 2 or 3 years than all the previous years combined. There are now professional journals, and your libraries are filled with dozens and dozens of books on global education, international communications, intercultural communications. Last year, a company that makes a series of movies called Going International, Griggs Copeland, also came out with a film series called Valuing Cultural Diversity. And this was so hot that they actually copyrighted the words. I got a letter from Copeland saying you can no longer use these words in your speeches, in your classrooms. You can't title a course this. So I want to warn you, you're violating the copyright of Griggs Copeland if you use the word valuing cultural diversity. So they now have the copyright, just like Pepsi-Cola and Kleenex. But that shows you how hot the field is. We, of course, have Workforce 2000, a report that tells us domestically we are all going to be working in a diverse environment, and our students are going to enter a workforce that is different than any other workforce we've had in the history of the United States. By the year 2000, at least 85% of all those entering the workforce will be either female or minorities. The workforce is going to be incredibly diverse. And yet we know on the top management of many corporations and unfortunately a few universities, it's primarily white male. I did a workshop yesterday for the CIA, and they have a problem because over 97% of the top management of CIA are not only white male, but they're Mormons and Catholics. And they decided they have a problem. Their turnover rate of blacks and other minorities is extremely high. And this isn't just CIA, this is every organization in the country. In the area of business, this is extremely popular right now. Estee Lauder, 3 years ago, gave the Wharton School of Finance $10 million to internationalize their curriculum. I wish Estee Lauder would come to our university, but anyway, $10 million to internationalize the curriculum. We know today that the business community is international. There's no doubt about it. And as an academic, I can say that this whole international thrust didn't come from us academics. It came from the business community. I mean, whatever the business world wants to pay money for, we'll find some way of teaching. And that's exactly what has happened because they realize that it is necessary to hire people who have a global perspective. The Japanese have over 10,000 citizens with American MBAs. Over 10,000. How many Americans do you suppose have Japanese MBAs? Actually, none, because they don't have MBAs in Japan, but nevertheless, very few of our American business people even speak Japanese, and the Japanese are giving us a run for our money. The Japanese have also taught us a lesson. For over 60 years, we thought that we were the most productive people on the face of the earth. For over 60 years, we used the words modernize, industrialize, and Americanize, as if they all meant the same thing. And what Japan and many other countries have told us is, yes, we want your expertise, yes, we want your technology, but no thank you, you can keep your culture. And we've said, wait, it's a package deal. You can't have one without the other. And they're saying, yes, we can, and in fact, if you're going to compete in the world, you better start looking at us. The whole economic climate has changed. Businesses are interested in this whole field because it can help people be more effective. It's that simple. It has nothing to do with humanitarian concerns and touchy-feelyism and so forth. The bottom line is the dollar. We know that anywhere between roughly 40 and I've heard as high as 70% of all American business people who go to work in Tokyo cannot adjust to the culture and must return home before they complete their assignments. 40 to 70%. It costs between $150,000 and $200,000 a year to keep an American in Tokyo, including salary and transportation and housing and so forth. And if you multiply that by the thousands of Americans working in Tokyo, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar problem. If you extrapolate around the world, then it is enormously high. The Peace Corps has a dropout rate in country of between 30 and as high as 50%. And yet we know through modern education and training, with many companies, we're able to cut the dropout rate down to less than 1.4%. Well, that's why companies are interested in this, because it saves money and it helps them to be more effective. On our campuses, we are diverse. We're going to be increasingly diverse. I mean, I don't want to give you a talk on demographic trends, but you know that the birth rate, the population rate of increase for, let's say, white Americans is below zero. I mean, below one. It's zero, actually. There's a minus. Whereas with minorities and immigrant groups, it's much higher. The fact is, young people coming into our universities are going to be increasingly more diverse. And yet, in the last year, we've had a 100% increase of racial incidents on our college campuses. Our campuses are experiencing the problems of the entire society. And throughout the society, we have these increased conflicts. The situation in New York with Koreans and black Americans seems to have a cultural basis. That is, Korean women very often will not put change in the hands of black patrons. And it's because in Confucian culture, you don't touch strange men. It's completely culturally based. But we have major incidents going on up in New York, and these incidents also are occurring on our campuses. Well, given all of this, as educators, I think we must be concerned with multiculturalism and global education. But I think we have a few naive assumptions that we must overcome as we move into this area. And I'd like to name about 4 or 5 naive assumptions. I can think of more, but we only have time for 4 or 5. One of the naive assumptions that I think we have is that as we become more diverse, our differences will disappear. We will somehow link arms and sing "We Are the World," and that will take care of it all. Somehow differences will be less important, and besides that, we're all basically the same. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. Exactly the opposite is true. As we become more diverse on our campus community and our society, the differences will become even more important. We become more consciously aware of our own culture and how it's different than other cultures. As long as you're surrounded by people who think the way you do, who share your values, your beliefs, your behaviors, your ways of looking at the world, you take them for granted. But all at once, when you're surrounded by people who are culturally different than you are, then you become more consciously aware of your own culture. And the irony is the way to find your culture is to leave it. Let's say someone here is from Wyoming. I don't know if anybody is, but you come to Washington, D.C. from Wyoming. First week in Washington, you get invited to a party in the Anacostia region of Washington. This is a very famous black community in Washington. It was the cultural center of Washington. But in Wyoming, there aren't too many black people, maybe 3, 4, I don't know. But in any case, you come to Washington and you have the good fortune of being invited to this party, and it's the first time you've been the only white in an all-black social environment. I promise you, when you leave the party that night, you will not be an expert on black Americans, but you'll know an awful lot more about white Americans, because you'll be forced to examine your differences. The black identity movement on college campuses in the 60s and 70s did not begin on black campuses. It began on white campuses. When large numbers of black students came onto white campuses, they're surrounded by all these white people, and all at once the question was, what does it mean to be black? Their culture became even more important to them. And I think we have to accept this, that as we become more culturally diverse, necessarily the differences become more important. And sometimes we want to deny these differences. We, again, assume that we're all basically the same. We're colorblind, we're gender blind, and so forth. Well, denying the differences doesn't help. As a matter of fact, I would argue just the opposite. Before you can have conversion, you must have diversion. And I think as educators, we have to raise awareness and begin to examine the differences before we can link arms, come together, and hum "We Are the World." Another naive assumption: if you just bring people together, automatically there will be understanding, hostility will disappear. It's all a matter of common sense. You don't need courses in the curriculum on this. I mean, it's just all common sense. Well, we know that this is not true, that in fact when we bring people together who are different, who may be hostile, the hostility may actually increase. We have the studies of integration in education in Boston, again in the 60s and the 70s, where there were white students who didn't like Afro-American students and vice versa, and we brought them together, especially on the high school level, thinking that if they're together in the classroom, they'll all like each other. No, in fact, the hostilities did not decrease. Why? Well, I mean, the old theory, Fessinger's theory of cognitive dissonance. When you engage in a behavior that contradicts your belief, you can't deny the reality of the behavior, you have to change the beliefs. Well, that's the theory. You get people to work together, then they won't dislike each other so much. Unfortunately, when you're sitting in a classroom, you can rationalize. You can say, the only reason I'm in the classroom with this person I don't like is because I have to be here to pass the course. Beliefs didn't change. Where the real change occurred was on the playground, when people got together voluntarily, because then you couldn't rationalize. Why are you out here playing ball with these people you don't like? Obviously, you must like them. Well, what I'm trying to suggest here is as your campuses, and this campus in particular, becomes more multicultural, becomes more globally aware, it doesn't take place just in the classroom. It has to be a total campus effort, in my opinion. That is, security, the Office of Student Life, the Counseling Center, all of these people have to be involved with the faculty, because the greatest amount of attitude change may not come in the classroom and may come on the campus itself. And it has to be a total effort, not just faculty teaching these courses. When we bring people together and they don't understand each other, they may dislike each other, we also can experience communications breakdowns. And communication breakdowns cause stress, they cause pain, and when we're talking about overseas assignments, they produce culture shock. And we all know a little bit about culture shock. Well, the same thing is true domestically. When we bring students onto our campus who are different culturally than the average student, necessarily they go through a communications breakdown. They experience stress, and they go through a kind of culture shock. And this may indeed help explain the dropout rate of many of these students. But it has nothing to do with intelligence or motivation. If you took a bunch of American students and put them in Tokyo, I promise you they would have adjustment difficulties. We wouldn't expect them to perform as well in Tokyo as they do here initially. And we would somehow try to help them to understand the process of adapting to that new culture in Tokyo. I think we have to do the same thing on our campuses. In the 1970s, UCLA decided they wanted Indians. Indians were the in-ethnic group one semester, and so they brought in 100 Native Americans. The first semester, every single student failed out of UCLA. And people sat around and said, see, we told you they couldn't do it. We told you. Well, of course you couldn't do it. I mean, again, it's the Tokyo example. How could you expect those Native Americans to adjust to the campus of UCLA without going through some stress, again, that we call culture shock? And again, I think culture shock is primarily a breakdown of interpersonal communications. And when communications breaks down, as I said, you and I experience pain. But we don't realize that that's the source of our pain because we take the ability to communicate effectively for granted. We don't think about it very much. Here in the United States, and especially at universities, what kind of communications do we emphasize? Words, verbal communication. That's how we measure achievement and maturation and so forth. And if there's any sense we trust, it's our sense of vision. We say, I see, to mean I understand. Seeing is believing. I'm from Missouri, show me. What's more important than words? Words you can see, the written word. I mean, that's what we trust, at least mainstream Americans. If I go to get my automobile repaired, and the mechanic says it's $500, I don't want a smile and a handshake from this mechanic. I mean, I want a written estimate. And the same thing with the student sometimes who comes to see me. I mean, I've done what some of you have done. Why don't you write me a memo, and then we'll discuss it, right? Put it in writing first. And yet, when we're talking about people from non-Western cultures and even some ethnic groups here in the United States, they want to be physically present with that other person. Why? Because they want to look you in the eye. They want to hear your voice. They want to see your face to know if you're sincere or if you're not sincere. But putting something on a piece of paper, I can't feel any sense of communicating with you. But again, most of us Americans, mainstream Americans, don't trust our nonverbal ways of communication. With a smile and a handshake, you can touch another person. Americans don't touch. We don't like touching. If you touch someone except between the elbow and the shoulder on the street, if you're polite, you say, excuse me, I'm sorry. We go to Italy, we go crazy. Italians have their hands all over us. We can't stand being touched. The handshake is a quick, instantaneous release. Athletes, high five. If you're dealing with an African student, he's going to hold hands, and you're going to feel very uncomfortable trying to pull away. In other words, an instantaneous touch, that's it. With a smile and a handshake, I can look you in the eye. Well, with most mainstream Americans, eye contact is very important. You're talking to a student, you expect that student to look you in the eye. The way to tell you to get lost is to break eye contact. Yet for many African American males, they tend to break eye contact more frequently than white American males. How many white American males think the African American student has a chip on his shoulder? He's hostile. You don't know why. Is it anything he said? No. Well, how do you know that? Well, I just know that. Could it be that it was a matter of breaking eye contact? I mean, all of these factors go into causing communications to break down. And what I'm saying here is inevitably communications are going to break down. We experience pain and we react. And those reactions are normal and natural when we go through culture shock. There's a psychologist our counseling people can tell us about by the name of Azrin, who's now teaching in Florida. I think he's at Nova University. Azrin did a very famous experiment where he put a rat in a cage with an electric grid on the bottom. And then he turned on the electricity. And the first thing the rat did was run out of the cage. And Azrin said, "That's incredible." That's a journal article. Whenever you administer pain to any animal, the first thing the animal does is try to escape or avoid the painful stimulus. Well, human beings are the same way. Our students are the same way. Our staff and faculty are the same way. When we experience the pain of the breakdown of interpersonal communications, we begin to react. And one of the first reactions is to try to get out of that cage. How many students come onto our campus who are culturally different, who are going through this, and they spend a lot of time wondering how to get out of here? This is the biggest mistake of my life. I mean, they try to escape. But Azrin took his experiment one step further. He put 2 rats in that cage with the electric grid on the bottom. I used to show this film in class, by the way, and I've stopped because my animal rights students have protested. But it's an interesting film. Anyway, he puts 2 rats in the cage with the electric grid on the bottom. He turns on the electricity, and then, being a sadistic psychologist, he closed the doors. And he watches the rats, and they kind of hop around with the electricity and try to get out of there. And eventually, the 2 rats attack each other. And eventually, they kill each other. And Azrin said, "That's incredible." I mean, that's another journal article. Whenever you administer pain to an animal and there's no way to escape the painful stimulus, irrational aggression sets in. Irrational aggression. And of course it's irrational. If it were rational, the 2 rats would attack Azrin or the cage. But instead they attack each other. Well, we're the same. We move into a new cultural environment where there's a breakdown of communication, where everything is different, we're disoriented. We can't escape. I mean, most of your students can't drop out. They may be the first students in their family to go to school. For an international student, their families have spent the last 3 months saying goodbye. I mean, they can't go home. They can't escape, and so they are trapped, and therefore it is quite likely that they're going to be angry, they're going to be aggressive, and usually that anger is not taken out on the source of the anger, the professor. They take it out on somebody who's lower in the social hierarchy, a roommate, a clerk, a staff member. Like the little boy who gets a spanking from his mother and walks out the door and kicks the cat. I mean, the same phenomenon occurs. And on our campus, a lot of our problems are because the student who's culturally different goes through these reactions, but we end up reacting to the reactions. I mean, we don't look at that student who's culturally different and say, maybe the student isn't hostile. Maybe the student doesn't have a chip on his shoulder. Maybe it's a reaction to entering this diverse cultural environment that we wanted so bad. Maybe that's what's going on. But no, we often don't look at it situationally. We say, well, that's the way those students are. Those Nigerians, they're always hostile, they're always getting into trouble. No, it may be a result of the diversity itself. And as I said, we do react. I mean, our security reacts and so forth. And the reactions to the reactions produce a kind of conflict cycle. At least at our campus, many of our faculty and staff just want to take control. I mean, they've got to go in there and calm things down, take control, and often they muck it up. They make it worse. I mean, it's like when a child throws a piece of paper on the floor, and those of you who are parents know what I'm talking about. The child throws the paper on the floor and you say, pick it up. You're going to take control. The child says, no, I won't pick it up. And you say, pick it up. No, I won't pick it up. And pretty soon, you're down on the linoleum with that 4-year-old acting more childish than the kid. You've gotten into a conflict, and you're the adult. You're the one who's supposed to say, now, calm down. I don't know why you threw the paper down, but, I mean, we get caught up in these conflicts, and we can't break out of it. The point I'm trying to make here is if we are going to move our campus to a multicultural level, if we are going to try to create a culturally diverse campus, then we who want control so bad ought to be aware of what's going on. We are the ones who ought to stand up and break that conflict cycle. But sometimes we can't. And again, sometimes we have to be in control. I teach police hostage negotiation a little bit, and I've done police training. And police have this incredible need for control. I mean, it's an occupational need, but often they do go into situations where they don't understand what's going on. And they react, and they sometimes make it worse. It's like a cat going up a tree. A cat goes up a tree, what do? You call the fire department, the neighbors come, and everybody tries to get that cat out of the tree. Well, if you got rid of the hook and ladder and the neighbors left, the cat would come down from the tree. You do not see dead cats hanging from trees. And sometimes the same thing is true in these situations. Let me give you 2 or 3 other naive assumptions. Another naive assumption is somehow we can develop cookbooks, do's and don'ts lists for dealing with people from other cultures. If you're going to bring in a lot of Hispanics into your university, well then let's develop a cookbook on Hispanics. And everybody watch the films on Hispanics, teach a couple courses on Hispanics, and that'll take care of it. I mean, we don't need all this culture shock stuff and Festinger and so forth. I would argue nobody can write a cookbook on another culture. Berlitz is now getting into cross-cultural training. I mean, it's amazing. I got a call from a Berlitz outfit in Chicago, said, would you come in and do a 1-day cross-cultural training program for GM people going to Mexico, and all we want is a cookbook. And I said, I don't do cookbooks, but that's what they wanted, a cookbook. Because most people really want cookbooks. That's what they want. I mean, if you're going to have diverse students coming here, just give me the cookbook on those students. Don't give me all this theory and these studies and so forth. It's like my students. I'll be lecturing on something I think is profound, the meaning of truth, or something of that sort, just rolling along, and I'll have an 18-year-old student raise his hand and say, Dr. Weaver, is this going to be on the exam? In other words, just give me the stuff that's going to be on the exam. Don't give me all this theory. And I'm saying the theory is what's important. And if you believe you can have a cookbook, I think you're being sadly misled. Because nobody could write a cookbook on people from another culture that would be absolutely accurate. If I was going to give you a cookbook on Hispanics, which Hispanics? Venezuelans or Mexicans? They're very different. They all speak Spanish, but they're culturally very, very diverse. And that cookbook might be counterproductive because inevitably you'd run into a situation that's not covered in the cookbook. What do you do then? You mentally thumb through the index of the book. It's not there. Total panic sets in. I think it's much more useful to have a broad framework for understanding and interpreting any situation. And that framework must be rooted in how people from different cultures think, how they behave, what happens when they interact, and so forth. Now, some cookbook information is useful. I don't deny that. I mean, if for no other reason than it decreases the probability of hostility based upon differences, what we used to call prejudice. And the best definition of prejudice I've ever heard was given by the psychologist Adorno. And Adorno defined prejudice as being down on that which you are not up on. And I like that. I mean, the less you know about people who are culturally different, the easier it is to be down on them. So some of that information is useful, but in and of itself, it's insufficient. A fourth naive assumption. All you have to do is apply the basic psychological principles that we all know to management, to communications, to business, to all of our courses, and that's enough. You don't need all this global education, multiculturalism business. And I would say that's extremely naive, because I taught psychology, by the way, for a number of years, so I'm not against psychologists. But one of the problems with psychologists who are responsible for many of these principles of management is that psychologists believe all rats behave the same. And they're primarily white male rats. I mean, one of the problems with these theories is that they emphasize similarities. Similarities. It goes back to that first assumption. Whereas anthropologists tend to emphasize differences. And we've got to find the balance between the similarities and the differences. And I think we ought to examine all of our basic assumptions in this area. and even our assumptions regarding education. I remember schools of education used to argue that one way for a child to be healthy and one way that the child can develop long-term relationships, and even the adult, is to engage in self-disclosive behavior. I mean, I sat on a dissertation committee where one of my students was talking about self-disclosive behavior. And we thought it was kind of linear. You know, you like when you fall in love, you tell all your secrets, and then what happens? You get married, and it just progresses like that. It leads to intimacy and long-term relationships. There are new studies that show that that's not true at all. You people who are married here, do you sit around the kitchen table being self-disclosive every night? It's not linear at all. It's kind of zigzag. I mean, when you want to start the relationship, yeah, it works. But for long-term marriages, it doesn't work, and it definitely doesn't apply to blue-collar people. Well, for at least 15 years. That was the official word. Self-disclosive behavior leads to long-term relationships. Today, we know it's not true at all. Well, we ought to examine many, many of our assumptions in the light of cultural variance. The fifth naive assumption, and I can't develop this in great detail, this assumption is that somehow people interact, there are differences, but they'll all work out. You just apply some of the principles of conflict and conflict resolution, and it will work out for everyone. I mean, that's it. Again, there are universal assumptions here. And I would say, yes, sometimes there are differences. It's simply a disagreement. But how do you know whether it's a disagreement or a real conflict? And if it is a real conflict, how do you know if it's escalating or de-escalating? How do you resolve it? How do you know whether it's time to negotiate or it's the end of the rope? The answers to all these questions are specific to our own cultures, and they do not apply universally. And believe me, today we're examining this question in the Middle East because we're not quite sure anymore. I mean, just to give you a Middle Eastern example because it's fresh in your mind. Very often in the Middle East, and I've lived in the Middle East, in Iran and in Saudi Arabia, and I spent some time in Kuwait, you'll see two men in the marketplace, like in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and they'll start shouting at each other. Well, you know that's a conflict. And out of nowhere will come a crowd to watch these two guys. And they never start punching each other out. Usually there's a little ritual. One guy will take off his watch and hand it to his friend because he doesn't want to lose his watch. The other guy will hand his ring to his other friend. And this can go on for a half hour, 45 minutes. And then, just before the two guys throw blows, what happened? The crowd surges in, grabs the two guys, holds them apart. And you get the impression if the crowd let those two guys go, they'd kill each other. 9 times out of 10, I have never seen an Arab punch out another Arab in the marketplace. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is a reflection of the culture throughout the Middle East. There's an assumption that if harm should come to another person and you could prevent it and you don't, then you're indirectly responsible for it. If that crowd of friends and neighbors let these two guys kill each other, then they would all be responsible for it. In other words, not only is there a concept of indirect responsibility, but the only way you solve problems and conflicts is to have a third party step in, the crowd. Not only that, each of these guys can go home to his wife that night, and Abdul can tell his wife, I would have killed Muhammad, but the crowd stopped me. You see how it works? It's beautiful, isn't it? The problem is, when Muhammad comes to your college. He comes to your college and he's sitting in class with students, and he's over in the cafeteria one day and somebody stands up and starts talking about dirty Arabs. Muhammad stands up thinking, well, I know these students, they're in class with me, they're going to step in and stop this. What happens? Muhammad gets decked, and by the time security comes, nobody saw anything. We don't believe in indirect responsibility. We say if there's a fight between two people, it's between the two of them. And we generally don't solve problems by using intermediaries. And yet, how did we get our hostages out of Iran? Did we just sit down with the Iranians and talk it over? No, Algeria was the intermediary, in Arabic called a wasta. How did we get our hostages off the TWA flight? We used Algeria. What did Carter do with the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel? He acted as an intermediary, a wasta. And this, of course, is why King Hussein was here yesterday to a large extent. Because I would say, if you assume that somehow Iraq and the United States are just going to sit down and work this thing out, I think you're extremely naive, because it won't work. Now, this is just one tiny example of different attitudes toward conflict and conflict resolution. And again, I think we ought to examine these assumptions and factor in cultural differences. Well, what is the value of all this? I mean, why are we doing it? First of all, I would argue, as we become more culturally diverse, as the world becomes smaller, as conflicts clearly are international, then I think we're going to have to somehow prepare our students for this multicultural world. In other words, the primary value of all this is not to help people just become more humanitarian. It's not to help them become more sensitive. I think that's good, and I'm all for that. But it's to help them be more effective and to be more well-educated for the world that they're going to live in. I mean, given the world as it is today, and the United States as it is today, I would argue that we would have difficulty saying we've really educated a person at a university if we haven't prepared them for that world. I mean, how could you do that? It's part of the future. And I think as educators, to help them be more effective and to really be educated, we have to consider these areas. I think also the value of helping our students and ourselves become more globally minded, to become comfortable in a multicultural environment, is that through this interaction, we tend to learn something about ourselves. We gain a kind of awareness of our own culture and our own values that you don't get if you stay in your own culture. I have graduating seniors who come to me, as they come to many of you. They finish 4 years of college, or 2 years of college, let's say, and then students will come to me and say, Dr. Weaver, I don't know what I want. You know, should I go to grad school? Should I get a job? I'm not sure what's important to me anymore, and so forth. And I often say, well, there are a couple things you can do to sort this out. You can go into psychotherapy. I mean, they'll help you sort it out. They'll tell you what's important to you. You'll get your identity together and so forth. But you could also join the Peace Corps. And I promise you, when you go over to that village in the Peace Corps after 2 or 3 years, you will know who you are and what's important to you. And you will know something about your own culture that those who have never left it will never know. And it's a lot more fun and it's cheaper. So I think by helping our campus to be more diverse and encouraging our students to be comfortable in a diverse environment, we're also helping them to grow as individuals. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me. Best of luck.
Always enjoy a speaker that makes you think, and you made me think. Thank you. Another hand. We're supposed to be taking a break from 10, well, it was 10:06 to 10:15, and then we'll
You're going to have to come up front, Diane. Well, I thank all of you for attending. It's so nice to see a full house, and nice to also see people pro-thinking, which is very nice. As with Dr. Weaver's keynote speech, I think that in addition to international studies, oftentimes thinking skills falls into that same purview. And what I mean by that is that we as faculty members sometimes take a lot of things for granted, that we do keep up with cultural affairs and geographical happenings, and we also, by our position at the college, do think fairly well and sometimes take that for granted with our students. And one of the main points of critical thinking is the fact that it is a skill to be taught. While preparing for this introduction, I made two assumptions I am sure are not unwarranted. That this audience believes that the teaching of thinking is critical, and second, that this is not the same as the teaching of critical thinking. When carefully analyzed, critical thinking is a complicated task involving thinking dispositions, cognitive and metacognitive operations, and fundamental skills such as application, analysis, and evaluation. Furthermore, the era in which we live, a most singular time in human history, makes the skillful teaching of critical thinking a necessity for all who wish not merely to cope, but to prosper. We exist in an age when quantum mechanics has changed our fundamental concept of reality, where genetic research questions the definition of what it means to be human, and where the poisoning of our land, air, and water threatens the very existence of our planet. Serious challenges indeed. Yet another development, one a bit closer to academia, is humankind's prodigious ability to produce an overwhelming flood of information. This point reminds me of an experience I had in my early years at Thomas Nelson, back in what seems the dark ages, the mid-70s. You know, the time when we flower children had to face the reality of being displaced by the me generation. At that time, Rex Evans and I were teaching a study skills class, and one of the course objectives was the efficient and accurate taking of lecture notes. To aid the students in sharpening their skills, we invited Bobby Wright to give a brief talk. Her topic was the information explosion. While I sat there being the perfect example of effective note-taking, Bobby stated a fact that had a profound influence on me. The sum total of human knowledge was doubling every 5 years. Since then, the time interval decreased to every 3 years in the 1980s, and depending upon which expert one cites, the time frame is now down to 20 to 30 months for our current decade. Now, you and I have become rather immune to shock value of statistics, but this one should be an exception, for it has profound ramifications for our teaching profession. Such a fact means that no human, not even a devoted college professor, can possibly keep abreast in his or her chosen field, no matter how specific it may be. That this flood of information often creates more questions than answers, that we can no longer look even to the recent past as a valid touchstone for present and future actions. In essence, we are attempting to prepare our students for jobs, problems, and situations that do not exist even in the most vivid of imaginations. So what can we do? We can attempt to aid our students in their critical thinking, to make them better in problem solving, decision making, argument analysis, and most importantly, to foster the reflective skepticism so necessary in today's world. Yes, you might say that thinking comes naturally, like walking, but for many students, valid thinking does not. It, in most cases, must be taught, and unlike walking, valid thinking is more like running a marathon. Few can do it at all, and even fewer can do it well. And that brings us to our speaker, Dr. Jouette Powell, Dean of the School of Letters and Natural Sciences at Christopher Newport College, a man who thinks often and well. However, I make no claims as to his ability in long-distance running. Among Dr. Powell's many accomplishments are a Bachelor of Arts from Baylor University, a Bachelor of Divinity from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a Master's of Philosophy and a PhD in Religious Studies from Yale University. Dr. Powell has taught religion at Yale, the College of William and Mary, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Southern Seminary, and Christopher Newport College. In addition, Dr. Powell has won 2 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and is a member of numerous professional and scholarly associations, the American Academy of Religion, the American Philosophical Association, and the Southern Humanities Conference, to name a few. Furthermore, he is an author whose works have appeared in the Journal of Ecumenical Studies, the Downside Review, and the proceedings of the 1974 Ecumenical Study of Religion. Currently, Dr. Powell is working on an introductory religion and philosophy of religion text, tentatively entitled Basic Questions in the Study of Religion. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to introduce a rare combination of scholar, educator, and friend, Dr. Jouette Powell.
Thank you, Jerry. I want to thank those who've made it possible for me to be here today. And in terms of our topic, I know you probably share with me the hope that some sound thinking is going on about 75 miles west of here at this very moment. And I hope you'll feel gratitude. I hope we'll feel gratitude for what goes on there, and I hope you'll feel gratitude for what goes on here this morning. The subject which we shall consider together is an important one for anyone in education. My own academic discipline is religious studies, and my chief occupation at this time is academic administration. Neither of these, in the estimation of many, qualifies me to talk about principles of critical thinking. Actually, my topic may suggest to each of us something like a traditional apple pie, mother, and country speech. Critical thinking across the curriculum. Of course, who could be against it? Aren't we already doing it? My talk today has both the benefits and problems of a Memorial Day address or a 4th of July speech. On the one hand, it is hard not to be persuasive. Everyone knows what to expect you to say. Everyone agrees with your comments before you make them. So stir us a little bit and let us get on to the fireworks and the picnic. Lunch is at noon, correct? And thus our problem, how to convince each other and our students that a genuine issue of importance and potential dispute is being addressed. Aristotle called this kind of speech, this kind of rhetorical situation, epidictic. He saw these declarations that we and I will be making, he saw them as based in a body of beliefs and values taken for granted by a community. And to be sure, the academic community affirms the centrality and high value of the reflective life and the dominant role of critical thinking within it. We share the affirmation of Socrates that the unexamined life is not worth living, or at least, I'm not sure I want to go that far, or at least we would affirm that the unexamined life is not as fulfilling and is potentially dangerous to the individual and to society. After all, a common injunction is think before you act. Each of you could stand here today and recite the litany of affirmations and injunctions associated with the academic community's prizing of the reflective life. First, you would point to critical thinking as a central purpose of education. You could cite a plethora of reports which assert both the need for higher order, that is, analytic and synthetic thinking skills, to meet the challenges of the future, and which describe the sad state of preparation on the part of United States students to meet that future. Test results show time and again that these students can master basic information and perform one-step mathematical problems, but that they perform very poorly on more complex analytical tasks, whether those tasks are oriented toward the interpretation and criticism of text or the solution of more complex scientific and mathematical problems. In a recent summary report issued by the Educational Testing Service, you find the following results. The majority of high school graduates are unable to understand relatively complicated information. use basic algebra, or evaluate the appropriateness of scientific procedures. 61% of 17-year-olds cannot find, understand, summarize, or explain relatively complicated information, including material about topics they study in school. In mathematics, 49% of 17-year-olds cannot compute with decimals, fractions, and percentages, recognize geometric figures, or solve simple equations, while, more to the point, 94% cannot solve multi-step problems or use basic algebra. And one more, 93% cannot infer relationships and draw conclusions using detailed scientific knowledge. And yet, a report issued at about the same time by the U.S. Department of Labor, many of you are probably familiar with it, Workforce 2000, says that those jobs requiring more complex skills are the fastest growing in number. In fact, I have a little graph here that has bars that show the skills needed in reading, language, and math, and then it divides jobs into declining job categories. I know your vision is terrific. But at any rate, at the bottom, for those categories of jobs that are declining, the level of skills is the lowest needed or required. And then at the top, for the fastest growing job categories, the skills needed are the greatest. Yet, this kind of pragmatic argument would not entirely cover what we would want to say about the role of critical thinking in a person's education. You and I would want to affirm, indeed revel in, the value of analytical thinking to one's human development, to one's most complete fulfillment in and enjoyment of life. We would point to the rewards of intellectual engagement with imaginative literature, the fine arts, philosophy, theory in all fields. We would promote grappling with the big questions. We would support independent, open reflection on all questions. We would affirm the role of such in maintaining a free society. This last point leads directly then to the second affirmation of our three-part epidictic discourse, our 4th of July speech, if you will. We would support critical thinking as the basis of a democratic society. A well-informed, critically reflective citizenry, we can almost hear ourselves saying, is the foundation of a free society. And third, we would cite the importance of critical thinking to individual and national creativity, inventiveness, problem solving, and leadership. We might cast our argument here in terms of the need to meet global problems in concert with others, environmental pollution as an example, or in terms of our competitive standing vis-a-vis other nations. And now on to the hot dogs and lemonade. But wait, someone in the audience has a hand up. We note that it's one of those new students. Could they have a question? Why? Aren't we all agreed on this? Victor Turner, the anthropologist who ended his illustrious career at the University of Virginia, somewhere in the state, would call this a liminal moment. Liminal stemming from the Latin word limen, meaning boundary or border or threshold. The new student, this initiate, if you will, is being asked to enter a new stage in his or her formation, to cross into new territory, and to share the conviction of a new culture. While the expectation and probability is that they, with relative comfort and acquiescence, will do so, the possibility does exist that the transition will be characterized by great uncertainty and anxiety, perhaps even resistance. I think the same could happen at faculty level. After all, making this transition characteristically involves calling into question, subjecting to analysis and criticism, assumptions from other arenas of epidictic discourse, political, moral, and religious, among others. Anxiety and its associated sense of danger can come upon students, parents, does this begin to sound familiar? Administrators, legislators, and even ourselves as we investigate and dissect authoritative traditions and institutions. Phyllis Schlafly, do I have to introduce her to you? Phyllis Schlafly has often charged that critical thinking is a code word for unyielding attacks on American society and the central convictions and values upon which it is based. In short, in her view, critical thinking is a threat to the American way of life. I hope I'm not creating a straw person there. I think I'm not. In regard to this challenge to critical thinking and its role in the curriculum, because we could have a student out there asking this question, perhaps a faculty member, I invite you to read when you have time, and I'm going to go over it a bit this morning. I invite you to read the excellent article entitled Critical Thinking and Obedience to Authority. This particular article appeared in the winter 1985 volume of National Forum, which is the Phi Kappa Phi journal, and is written by John Sabini and Maury Silver. Sabini and Silver begin their essay with a discussion of the Stanley Milgram experiments, as reported in Milgram's book, Obedience to Authority. And I want to read a sort of extensive selection that will give you, if you're not familiar with them, will give you a description of the experiments, but as much as anything, sort of put you in the situation, if I can. In these experiments, the subjects are faced with a dramatic choice, one apparently involving extreme pain and perhaps injury to someone else. When the subject arrives at the laboratory, the experimenter tells him or her and another subject, a pleasant, avuncular, middle-aged gentleman, actually an actor, that the study concerns the effects of punishment on learning. Through a rigged drawing, the lucky subject wins the role of teacher. And the experiment, I'm not sure what this says about teaching, but at any rate, the lucky subject wins the role of teacher and the experimenter's confederate becomes the learner. In the next stage of the experiment, the teacher and learner are taken to an adjacent room. The learner is strapped into a chair and electrodes are attached to his arm. It appears impossible for the learner to escape. While strapped in the chair, the learner diffidently mentions that he has a heart condition. The experimenter replies that while the shocks may be painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. The teacher is instructed to read to the learner a list of word pairs, to test him on the list, and to administer punishment, an electric shock, whenever the learner makes a mistake. The teacher is given a sample shock of 45 volts, the only real shock administered in the course of the experiment. The experimenter instructs the teacher to increase the level of shock one step on the shock generator for each mistake. We've often wished that we had something that's like this at our disposal. At any rate, okay, I've got to find my place. The generator has 30 switches labeled from 15 to 450 volts. Beneath these voltage readings are labels ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock, and finally double X. The experiment starts routinely. At the fifth shock level, however, the confederate grunts in annoyance. And by the time the 8th shock level is reached, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. Upon reaching the 10th level, 150 volts, he cries out, "Experimenter, get me out of here. I won't be in the experiment anymore. I refuse to go on." This response makes plain the intensity of the pain and underscores the learner's right to be released. At the 270 volt level, the learner's response becomes an agonized scream. And at 300 volts, the learner refuses to answer further. Maybe impossible. When the voltage is increased from 300 volts to 330 volts, the Confederate shrieks in pain at each shock and gives no answer. From 330 volts on, the learner is heard from no more, and the teacher has no way of knowing whether the learner is still conscious or, for that matter, alive. The teacher also knows that the experimenter cannot tell the condition of the victim since the experimenter is in the same room as the teacher. Typically, the teacher attempts to break off the experiment many times during the session. When he tries to do so, the experimenter instructs him to continue. If he refuses, the experimenter insists, finally telling him, "You must continue. You have no other choice." If the subject still refuses, the experimenter ends the experiment. We should expect that at most only a small minority of the subjects, cross-section of New Haven residents, would continue to shock beyond the point where the victim screams in pain and demands to be released. We certainly would expect that very, very few people would continue to the point of administering shocks of 450 volts. Indeed, Milgram asked a sample of psychiatrists and a sample of adults with various occupations to predict whether they would obey the orders of the experimenter. All of the people asked claimed that they would disobey at some point. Aware that people would be unwilling to admit that they themselves would obey such an unreasonable order, Milgram asked another sample of middle-class adults to predict how far other people would go in such a procedure. The average prediction was that perhaps one person in 1,000 would continue to the end. The prediction was wrong. In fact, 65% of the subjects obeyed to the end. Now, Silver and Sabini go on. It is clear to people who are not in the experiment what they should do. The question is, what features of the experimental situation make this clear issue opaque to subjects? So that's their question. And they go on in their essay to propose several answers. First, entrapment by gradual increases in commitment is a common pathway to involvement in what we might judge immoral behavior. Second, the experimenter, it's like you make a little bit on junk bonds, you make a little bit more, a little bit more. Second, the experimenter's presence and the supposed objective requirements of the situation increase the subject's willingness to obey authority. They saw themselves as simply meeting the requirements of the experiment under the direction of an authority. And third, subjects, and I think this is a very interesting observation, subjects were embarrassed to leave the experiment because the researcher forced them to give reasons for doing so. Now, let me read one more paragraph from the article. Some subjects attempted to justify their leaving by claiming that they could not bear to go on. But such appeals to personal reasons were rebutted by the experimenters reminding them of their duty to stay. If the subjects could not escape the experiment by such claims, then how could they escape? They could fully escape his power only by confronting him on moral grounds. It is worth noting that this is something that virtually none of the hundreds of subjects fully did. Failing to address the experimenter in moral terms, even, quote, disobedient subjects just passively resisted. They stayed in their seats, refusing to continue until the experimenter declared the experiment over. They did not do things we might expect them to. Leave, tell the experimenter off, release the victim from his seat, and so on. And then again they say, why didn't they do this? And again they mention embarrassment, but let me go on and say what they mean by that. To confront the experimenter directly on moral grounds would be to disrupt in a profound way implicit expectations that grounded this particular, indeed most, social interaction. Namely, that the subject and experimenter would behave as competent moral actors. So they were embarrassed because they were questioning the moral quality of the other agent. I remember a famous line in a book that I use quite often, Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And in that book, she tells the story of the Wannsee Conference, at which the topic of the, quote, final solution was introduced. One of the things she makes clear is that Eichmann, among others, of course, never asked what the problem was. They had to find a solution, but they never asked, what's the problem? Here's the solution to the problem, but what is it? Second thing is, he says afterwards about this conference when he was on trial, that he didn't think it was appropriate for him to call in question the opinions of all of these important people. I mean, after all, they were much higher in rank, they were leaders of the government, and so on. And then Arendt says something that I have memorized at this point, and it fits so well here. She says, he was not the first person to be ruined by his modesty. And one of the problems Sabini and Silver then point out is that it's often a disagreeable and potentially very dangerous human tendency to obey authority. And one of the issues of critical thinking, and one of the things that Shafley, I think, is afraid of, really, or certainly sees as dangerous, is in critical thinking, you have to teach persons how to confront authority. Here were dozens, hundreds of subjects who went through this experiment, and as he says, as they say, not one of them ever completely confronted the experimenter about the morality of what he was doing and asking them to do. We do not have a recipe for being an authority who at the same time encourages criticism, even of himself or herself. But we do know that this is what is important. To teach persons to think critically is to train them to expose their thinking to others, to open themselves to criticism from their peers as well as from authority figures. In this, you and I have to be not only authorities, but models. In gaining this ability in relation to their own thinking, these students also develop the ability to subject others to criticism. And here's the really painful part of that, including us. Two other kinds of objections to the teaching of critical thinking skills, habits, and values are made on a regular basis. What I'm trying to show here is, even though it sounds like apple pie and so on, really there are strong arguments, or at least cultural tendencies, that cause the whole idea of critical thinking either to be disregarded or actively resisted. So there are two other kinds of objections I'd like to deal with. How often have you guessed that a student not only likes watching TV more than reading, but also spends significantly more time at the former than at the latter? Neil Postman, professor of communications at New York University, has written extensively about what it means to teach in an electronic era. He notes that ours is not the age of the printed text. Rather, he claims the printed word has moved to the periphery of our culture, and the electronic image has taken its place at the center. Advertisers and others communicating on television do not use propositions which can be tested for their validity and truth. How many times does McDonald's tell you the percentage of ingredients in their hamburgers on their TV advertising commercials? A McDonald's commercial, for example, is not a series of testable, logically ordered assertions. Rather, it creates a world of visual images. You know, that nice old guy who has a job down at McDonald's. And just so, political campaign advertisements and most TV news programs, I mean, why did Dan Rather go to Baghdad? Whatever critical thinking is, then, it must not be focused only on verbal discourse, but also on visual and auditory media. Students must first become aware that these media have a governing influence on their lives. They need to be able to analyze what the messages of the images are. And finally, they need to be able to subject those images and messages to critical scrutiny. So what I'm suggesting is for the student who, I know my daughter, she watches a lot of TV, for the student who is, maybe even more than we, a product of the electronic age, maybe one place to start with critical thinking is with visual images as opposed to text, which may appear initially very foreign to the student. Finally, you and I do hear, and will continue to hear, the declaration from students: I came to college to get a better job, not to learn how to analyze arguments. Of course, you and I know that the argument regarding the purposes of education goes back at least as far as the time of Socrates, in his debate with the sophists about the proper meaning of the word and concept arete. The ambiguity in the meaning of the word typifies the nature of the dispute well. The word itself has two primary meanings: skill and virtue. According to the sophists, the primary aim of education is imparting skills or know-how, some basis for how to get ahead or get along at least. In particular, they promise to teach persons how to bring and to win lawsuits. If you're familiar with Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, you'll recall a rather ludicrous case of that. Socrates, on the other hand, believed that the purpose of education was to become a certain kind of person with certain values and habits of mind. Obviously, colleges do both, though the emphasis may fall on one and then on the other in different eras. I would respond here, without repeating everything I've said earlier, that we live in a time where there seems to be an uncanny confluence of these two aims. The jobs awaiting graduates are those in which the higher order skills will be the most necessary. But I do not want to make the case for education and critical thinking overly dependent on vocational or economic grounds. I would still want to point to our lives as citizens having political responsibilities and as individuals seeking personal meaning and fulfillment. If our epidictic discourse has now become subject to critical scrutiny from those persons with their hands up, but we are now re-persuaded that indeed we ought to teach critical thinking, how can we go about it? First, I need to make a distinction. The distinction is between critical thinking and logic, or more particularly, informal logic. Informal logic is the content of courses usually taught in departments of philosophy, and some portion of which sometimes are taught in composition courses. Those topics are centered around the analysis of arguments, their general characteristics and certain types of terminology associated with those characteristics, their common errors or fallacies, and their components of success, such as sound evidence and proper inference. So informal logic has those component parts. Critical thinking has been defined by Robert Ennis as the reflective thinking involved in trying to base one's actions and beliefs on good reasons. Critical thinking is, then, to be understood as a much broader concept than informal logic, including, as it does, much more than argument analysis and assessment. Critical thinking is an activity, whereas informal logic is a subject matter. Critical thinking involves thinking in accordance with and under the potential judgment of a set of standards. Those standards are as diverse as the forms of life or activities which we human beings undertake. For example, I wrote this, so help me, before last evening. For example, economic forecasting, building a house, analyzing a poem, deciding upon an appropriate air conditioning system, arguing for or against the existence of God, presenting one's position on the abortion issue, properly rotating crops, or questioning the standards used in a given arena. Of course, the two are not mutually exclusive. There's much for any thinker to learn from informal logic, but a course in informal logic is not a prerequisite for critical thinking or teaching critical thinking. After all, informal logic is the product, not the starting point, is the product of critical reflection on acts of critical thinking. Thus, we all practice critical thinking with more or less seriousness and success, whether we have knowledge of informal logic or not. Including critical thinking, and this is a point I really want to drive home, including critical thinking in your course is not the point. It's already there. Okay? The point is to be more conscious of its presence and to engage students in it so that they become better at it. Now let me move on to some specific examples. You thought, boy, I thought we'd never get here. Some specific examples of how this conscious reflection and practice might take place in a variety of courses. I have to tell you that all of this I owe to other faculty members at CNC. These faculty members have participated in a workshop seminar over the last 2 years in which they have developed ways in which they can incorporate critical thinking more fully and self-consciously into their courses. This was a grant-funded activity, so there you are. One characteristic of critical thinking we might agree on is attending to detail or close, careful observation, listening, reading. In an introductory psychology course taught at the college, the professor begins with a 5-minute silent film. The students are instructed to watch it closely and to be prepared to describe what they've seen. The film depicts a man and a woman standing near a street corner. The woman opens her purse, removes her wallet, and appears to count her money. The man then robs the woman at gunpoint and takes her wallet. A second man, also holding a gun, then robs the first man of the woman's wallet and the man's watch. The second man points his gun in the direction of the first man, and the first man drops to the sidewalk. The second man walks quickly to a car located around the corner, gets in on the right-hand side, and the car drives away. Immediately when the film ends, students are asked to write down what they have observed. After 5 minutes, the professor collects the papers. He then reads them aloud after asking the students to stop him whenever he reads a statement that is not directly inferable from what they have seen in the film. Okay? Some students, and according to Dr. Dorries, who uses this, some students, very often as many as 40%, refer to the woman as a lady. Some state that the woman was flashing her money and thereby inviting robbery. Since the first man and the woman are standing within 20 feet of a portable bus stop sign, many students understand them to be waiting for a bus. In the course of the exercise, students begin to realize that their observations were either careless or selective or filtered through experiences and value judgments not clearly inferable from the film. Such an exercise can be modified for use in almost any course. And one of the things you might think about is how could I do that? A historian might select a sequence from the screenplay of a documentary. A professor of English might show a segment from some literary film epic. The chemistry instructor might videotape a brief experiment and ask his or her students to report what they observed. The professor of art history could present a series of works by some well-known artists. The business instructor might have his or her students read a portion of a case history. In any case, one of the keys to this whole thing is you've got to have hard copy or a film to show to the students later. And the reason is, one of the things Lee Dories has run into is that there are some students that have to view the film 3 or 4 times before they're convinced that what they wrote was not in the film. But it's a good exercise for showing students that looking carefully and thinking about the screen through which you're looking is an important component of thinking critically. Another characteristic of the critical thinker is the ability to tolerate ambiguous and conflicting information and points of view. One method to promote the development of this activity is the inquiry method, as described by Neil Postman and Charles Weingartner in their book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity. They're very Phyllis Schlafly, you can imagine, not too fond of their approach. The method involves asking students an initial question which does not have a single clearly right or wrong answer. Students must then respond by asking questions. No declarative statements are allowed. And perhaps it's obvious the reason for this is, you know what happens. So you're going to get people in shouting matches and their faces are going to get red and so forth and so on. But somehow by having to think, first of all, it's kind of difficult to think, how can I put this in a question? It sort of diffuses that whole tendency. As more and more questions are asked, a wider and wider diversity of perspectives come to the fore. Questions which do not yield to yes or no answers are considered preferable, as are questions which tend to support or challenge a previous question rather than taking the discussion in an entirely new direction. Let me give you some examples here. You could use a very general question to start. For instance, this is one that certainly fits in some ways the day, though it's changed rather quickly. If peace were to occur throughout the world, what might the consequences be for the American economy? Okay, and then students are going to have to respond by asking other questions. What does it mean to be an educated person? How do people use statistics to misrepresent information? Do 9 out of 10 doctors really recommend? If a teenager becomes pregnant, what alternatives does she have other than abortion? Then you can take those kind of general questions and put them into a more specific context. For instance, a history professor, after explaining the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions, might ask the following question. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for America's involvement in World War II? Or, for that matter, the Persian Gulf conflict? A physicist might ask, under what conditions would time appear different from the way people ordinarily experience it? And see, the curious thing here, of course, is the great thinkers like Einstein and others obviously used this method. They began to ask themselves a series of questions, and from that, some new perspective unfolds. I thought of one this morning that might help. You could begin a discussion and say, what if Adolf Hitler had been prevented from annexing Poland? And then a person might say, would Russia have entered the war on the side, excuse me, on the side of the Allies? If Russia had not entered the war on the side of the Allies, would the Allies have won the war? And you can begin to unfold questions that enable students to think in new directions. Other competencies associated with the development of critical thinking are the following, and I'm just going to list these and then I'll give a couple of more examples. Separating relevant from irrelevant information. Identifying underlying assumptions. Distinguishing statements of fact from statements of feeling. That one I always like to say is a all of these can be questioned by the inquiry method. You wouldn't necessarily want to disparage statements of feeling when you do that. You just want to make sure that students understand the difference. Generating alternative hypotheses, testing hypotheses systematically, making appropriate generalizations, and formulating tenable conclusions. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. In relation to identifying underlying assumptions, students might be given, I would probably be stronger and say probably should be given at some point, a statement of the assumptions underlying the professor's approach to a given subject, and a statement of possible alternative assumptions. Now, of course, what that requires of the professor is two things. One, they have to be aware that they have assumptions. I'm in the humanities, and so I sometimes joke with my social science friends that they're not aware they have assumptions. So it takes awareness, and then secondly, it takes the willingness to expose those assumptions to the class, and then possible other assumptions. In psychology, for example, one could explain the differing assumptions of, let's say, what I'll call, for lack of a better term, a scientific, perhaps it's even a positivistic, an existentialist, and a humanistic approach. In fact, again, Lee Dories does that. A historian or political scientist might explore the assumptions of economic determinism versus myth-based values, and I'm using myth in a positive sense there, not negative, versus myth-based values as the driving forces of human history. In relation to, and then of course you lead the student to say, what would the difference be in the analysis if you start with one set of assumptions as opposed to the other? In relation to generating alternative hypotheses, one might use a simple case. This is a way to get students thinking initially, like that of a squirrel seen feeding or searching for food on the ground near a tree. A dog barks nearby, and the squirrel runs up the tree. We've all seen this, I think. Soon he's back down on the ground. The dog barks again, and once more the squirrel runs up the tree. These events repeat themselves several times. Then one turns to the class after describing this and asks two questions. What seems to indicate a cause-effect relationship between the dog's barking and the squirrel running up the tree? And secondly, you say, is it possible that the squirrel was not responding to the bark? And then you invite the class to imagine several ways in which they could explain what happens without connecting the bark to the going up the tree. A more complex case is the following. There are 600 students in an introductory psychology course. The instructor decides, in teaching the descriptive characteristics of mental disorders, to use a 30-minute movie which depicts and describes these disorders, allotting 10 minutes each to the three major classes of disorders. A lecture was also prepared which served as background commentary to the movie, but was completely meaningful in itself without the movie. The class was split into two equal groups from an alphabetical listing of the names. The first name, along with the person to whom it belonged, was assigned to the lecture-only group. The second person to the movie lecture group, and so forth, until you had 300 in each group. The two groups then met in adjacent but equivalent classrooms. The use of a microphone and speaker connection between the two rooms, the use of a monitoring system, and considerable practice allowed the lecture to the lecture-only group to serve as the background commentary for the movie lecture group. The instructor appeared in neither room, but delivered the commentary from an isolated booth. Both groups received exactly the same auditory information at exactly the same time. Immediately after the completion of the movie, all subjects were given a common test over the material covered in the lecture. The two means, averages of test scores, did not differ. So the experimenter was forced to conclude that on this topic, one method appeared to be as good as the other. Then you would ask the class, do you accept that conclusion or not? And then why or why not? Well, let me ask you, do you accept that conclusion? I realize it's kind of hard sitting out there hearing all of this pumped at you. Remember, there are two groups. One saw a movie, but both heard exactly the same lecture at the same time. The rooms were equivalent and so on. And then the average of the test scores for each group were exactly the same. And the conclusion of the instructor was that the method didn't seem to make any difference. They appeared equally good.
What was the meaning of none? What were the meaning?
Oh, I don't know that. You would ask that. I'm sorry. I don't have enough information, so I didn't do my homework as well as I should. I don't know. That's a good question, though. Yeah.
I wonder what previous information they had before they entered the situation and that's what
Okay.
caused it.
Beg pardon?
Did the test measure, what they were actually doing?
Mm-hmm.
Was there a long-term effect as to the students' individual impact able to retain this level?
Okay.
Did they repeat the experiment with the same results?
Uh-huh.
Difficulty of the test.
Okay. May have been so simple that anybody could have passed it, right. Yeah, and I think implied by one of the, all these are the kinds of things you would hope students would say. But implied by one of the comments, at least, is that maybe what the instructor set out to show is whether it made a difference. What kind of difference? And did the test that he or she used, was it capable of showing that difference? I mean, if the only difference he was interested in was the average of test scores, then okay, he seemed to be able to handle that, and maybe not even that because of some of the comments you've said. But certainly there may have been other differences present in the two groups that his method didn't allow to show themselves. Three other areas of instructional focus on critical thinking should be mentioned, and I'm going to conclude with this. Reading, paper writing, and testing. Those are fairly familiar, aren't they? In our History of Philosophy course sequence, the class format is centered in the reading of text selections from important philosophers. The class discussion and course written assignments involve the recognition, analysis, and evaluation of arguments. The instructor provides both classroom instruction on the nature of arguments, how to recognize arguments, etc., and written materials to assist students in the endeavor. The term paper assignment involves developing an argument based on a proposition discussed in class. That's probably a fairly traditional use. The difference is that in this course there's much more self-consciousness about what are arguments, how do you recognize arguments, how do you evaluate arguments, and the class discussion is focused on that as opposed to discussion of odd things that Thales did. One of our professors of history has developed a course structure which emphasizes reading and writing critically on topics in history. The course begins with a diagnostic pretest, including a multiple choice section culled from old advanced placement exams. These questions are repeated on the final exam. The midterm exam and the final exam also involve essays based on a reading selection given to the students at the time of the exam. They are given explicit instructions as to what they are to do. On the midterm exam, they are asked to summarize the main idea of each paragraph of the reading selection, to evaluate whether the evidence supports the main idea in one paragraph selected from the total, and to write a paragraph synthesizing the overall interpretation of the selection and giving their reasons for agreeing or disagreeing with the argument. So the instructor sets that up. He doesn't say compare and contrast or something like I might tend to say. He's very much more specific in the kinds of directions that he gives the students in order to promote what is his goal in the course, or one of his goals. The essay on the final exam involves another reading selection. Students are once again asked to summarize the main idea of each paragraph. In addition, they're asked to compare and contrast the main idea and supporting evidence of one paragraph in the selection with the main idea and supporting evidence in a separate paragraph from a different source that's given with the question. Finally, in order to see if they're able then to do not only all that, but then put it to some contemporary application. Finally, they're asked to write a memo to President Bush in which they support or oppose a major goal in American foreign or domestic policy, using ideas and evidence drawn from the reading. So again, it's not out of their head. They have to base it on the reading they've been given. The instructor has worked out an elaborate grading scheme for evaluating the student's performance, including his or her progress in the course of the semester. And I have a copy of his grading sheets, of which you can look at if you'd like to. I wonder about, this is Bob Saunders, if you know him. And he must spend a lot of hours doing this, but it's an intriguing approach. Again, carrying the student through certain kinds of exercises to promote their abilities, the progress in those abilities. Similar projects have been carried out in sociology. One of the things done there by Leah Pellett that I think is just really basic, and we often don't think of this, is that when she gives a reading, in addition to giving the reading, she gives the students a list of critical thinking type questions that she believes they should look at as they read the selection. Now, after a while, hopefully you can wean the student from that and they can make up their own list, but it's not the most natural thing for most of our students to begin reading something and asking critical questions about it. So a little bit of help would be profitable. So other things in sociology, chemistry, political science, economics, and various business disciplines are trying to use these certain kinds of new methods. Any number, and here's a little pitch here maybe, but I hope a resource. Any number of these faculty members might be approached by TNCC or by individual instructors, and I'll be glad to share through Jerry the names of these persons and what they teach for more details on what they're doing, and only they can really do their efforts justice. Dr. John Hoagland of our Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies conceived and directed this project, and he himself is a leader in the country in this movement. I wish you well as you move forward in your efforts to make critical thinking an ever more important element across your curriculum. Perhaps the greatest difficulty and greatest satisfaction will be derived from those students who move from thinking of critical thinking and argument as negative and combative to seeing it as a journey that we can take together in search of the truth. Good journey.
Christopher Newport, like Thomas Nelson, is going through registration right now, and it was a definite gesture on Doc's part to come. He is committed to go back to campus at least by noon, but there